Our babysitter heard glass breaking upstairs and said, "The cat probably knocked something over. Stay down here." But then we heard footsteps that were too heavy to be a cat. The glass broke at 8:30 on a Friday night while my sister Mia and I were watching a movie in the living room with our babysitter Courtney. My parents had gone to their anniversary dinner at a restaurant downtown, dressed up and excited for their first night out in months. They'd left at 6, kissing us goodbye and reminding Courtney that we had to be in bed by 9. Courtney was 19, a college sophomore who'd been babysitting us for almost a year. My parents loved her because she was responsible and mature, always on time and never on her phone. Mia adored her because Courtney played games and did crafts and let us stay up 15 minutes past bedtime. I was 11 and thought I was too old for a babysitter, but I liked Courtney well enough. She treated me less like a little kid and more like a helper, asking my opinion on what movie to watch and letting me make popcorn in the microwave. The sound of breaking glass came from directly above us, from the area of my parents' bedroom. It was loud and distinct, the unmistakable crash of something shattering. Mia grabbed my arm and Courtney muted the television. We all sat frozen, listening. Our cat Whiskers was supposedly upstairs sleeping on my bed, but the sound had been too violent to be a knocked-over water glass. Courtney stood up and walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the second floor. The upstairs hallway was dark because we'd turned off all the lights except the ones in the living room and kitchen. She called out Whiskers' name twice, but the cat didn't appear. I told her that didn't sound like Whiskers, that our cat was small and couldn't make that much noise. Courtney turned back to us with this reassuring smile that felt forced. "Cats are clumsy. He probably jumped up on something and knocked it off. Your parents are going to be so mad at him." She walked back to the couch and sat down, reaching for the remote to unmute the movie. Mia asked if she was going to check what broke and Courtney said she would after the movie ended, that there was no point going up there now and scaring Whiskers more. She said cats got freaked out when they broke things and it was better to let him calm down first. I remember thinking that logic didn't make sense because usually when Whiskers knocked something over, he came running downstairs immediately afterward, startled by the noise he'd made. But Courtney was the adult and the person in charge, and I'd been taught to listen to babysitters the same way I listened to teachers and parents. We went back to watching the movie, but I couldn't focus anymore. My attention kept drifting to the ceiling, to the dark upstairs hallway I could see from my position on the couch. The house felt different suddenly, the air heavier and charged with something I couldn't name. Mia had moved closer to me on the couch, tucking herself against my side. She was 7 and scared more easily than I was, and I could feel her tensing every time the house made its normal settling noises. About 5 minutes after the glass broke, we heard footsteps. They came from the same area as the breaking glass, slow and deliberate. Definitely not cat paws on hardwood floor. These were heavy footfalls, the kind that made the old floorboards creak. Courtney heard them too because she went still, her hand frozen halfway to the popcorn bowl. The footsteps moved from my parents' room toward the hallway, then stopped. Mia whispered that someone was upstairs and Courtney shushed her quickly. I asked if we should call my parents and Courtney said no, that we'd just scare them for nothing. She stood up again and walked toward the stairs, and this time her confident posture was gone. Her shoulders were tight and she kept clasping and unclasping her hands. Courtney called up the stairs asking if anyone was there. The question felt stupid to me even then because if there was an intruder, why would they answer? But she stood there waiting for a response that didn't come. The house was completely silent now. No more footsteps, no sounds at all except the muted television and Mia's scared breathing. Courtney came back to the couch and told us very firmly to stay exactly where we were, not to move or make noise. She said she was going upstairs for just a minute to check on things, and we needed to be brave girls and wait for her. Mia grabbed Courtney's hand and begged her not to go, said we should all leave the house together and call the police from outside. Courtney pulled her hand away gently and said that was silly, that we couldn't just run outside in the cold over a broken glass and some creaky floorboards. She'd worked herself back into that reassuring babysitter mode, her voice bright and confident even though her hands were shaking. She promised she'd be right back and reminded us not to leave the living room. We watched Courtney climb the stairs and disappear into the dark hallway upstairs. I counted her footsteps, 14 steps up and then the sound of her walking across the landing. She called out again, her voice trying to sound brave but cracking slightly. She said if someone was playing a prank, it wasn't funny and they needed to show themselves right now. Then everything went quiet for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Mia was crying silently next to me, tears running down her face while she chewed on her thumbnail. I remember putting my arm around her and telling her it was okay, that Courtney would come back any second and everything would be fine. I was lying because I didn't feel fine at all. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong, that we shouldn't be sitting on this couch waiting. But Courtney had told us to stay and I'd been raised to be an obedient kid who followed instructions from adults, even when those adults were 19-year-old babysitters who were making terrible decisions. The scream came without warning, a high-pitched shriek of pure terror that cut off abruptly after 3 seconds. It was Courtney's voice, unmistakable and filled with a fear I'd never heard from an adult before. Then came the sounds of a struggle, thuds and crashes, furniture being knocked over, and Courtney yelling, "No, no, please!" Mia jumped up from the couch, but I grabbed her and pulled her back down, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. We heard running footsteps, more struggling sounds, and then Courtney screamed my name. "Olivia, run! Take Mia and run!" Her voice was desperate and panicked, and then it was cut off again by a crash that shook the ceiling. Mia was sobbing now, full crying that she couldn't control, and I was trying to decide what to do. Courtney had told us to run, but she'd also told us to stay on the couch, and I was paralyzed by conflicting instructions and absolute terror. The sounds upstairs continued, dragging noises and heavy footsteps moving between rooms. Someone was definitely up there, someone who wasn't supposed to be, and they'd done something to Courtney. I finally made myself move, pulling Mia off the couch and toward the front door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the doorknob, and when I turned it, the door wouldn't open. It was locked. The deadbolt engaged from when Courtney had locked it after my parents left. We had one of those deadbolts that required a key from the inside, a security feature my dad had installed after a string of break-ins in our neighborhood the previous year. The key was supposed to hang on a hook by the door, but it wasn't there. I looked frantically for it, checking the small table by the entrance and the coat closet, but couldn't find it. Mia was pulling on my shirt, begging me to open the door, to get us out. I ran to the back door in the kitchen, pulling Mia behind me, but that door was also locked with a keyed deadbolt and no key in sight. The windows had security bars on the first floor, another of my dad's precautions. We were trapped inside with whoever was upstairs, all of his safety measures working against us. I grabbed the house phone from the kitchen wall and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher answered and I tried to explain what was happening, but my voice came out as a whisper because I was terrified the person upstairs would hear me. The dispatcher kept asking me to speak up and I kept saying as loudly as I dared that someone was in our house, that they'd heard our babysitter, that my sister and I were trapped. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, that police were being dispatched, and to find somewhere to hide immediately. I could hear sirens starting in the distance, but they sounded far away. Too far. Mia was clinging to me and crying so hard she was hyperventilating. The sounds upstairs had stopped completely, and that somehow felt worse than when we could hear the struggle. I didn't know if Courtney was okay or hurt or dead, didn't know where the intruder was or if they were coming downstairs next. The dispatcher kept talking to me, asking questions about where we were in the house and if I could see the intruder, but I could barely process her words through my panic. Then I heard the footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow, coming down toward us. Not rushing, not running, just walking with this terrible casual pace. Mia screamed and I dropped the phone, leaving it dangling by its cord while I pulled her toward the only hiding place I could think of, the pantry in the kitchen. It was a walk-in pantry that my mom kept meticulously organized, shelves of canned goods and boxes of pasta and cereal. I shoved Mia inside and squeezed in behind her, pulling the door almost closed but leaving it open just a crack so we wouldn't be completely trapped. We crouched down behind bags of flour and rice, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. Through the crack in the door, I could see into the kitchen and part of the living room. The footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. I heard them move across the hardwood floor of the living room, heard them pause. Then a voice, male and rough, said, "I know you're down here. I heard you on the phone." The voice wasn't angry or aggressive, just matter of fact, which made it more terrifying. The footsteps started moving again, walking through the living room into the kitchen. From our hiding spot, I could see his legs and feet as he passed the pantry door. He was wearing work boots and dark jeans, nothing remarkable or identifying. He walked to the kitchen counter where I'd dropped the phone and I heard him pick it up, then disconnect the call. He stood there for a moment and I held my breath, squeezing Mia so tight she made a small noise of protest. The man started opening cabinets and drawers, methodically searching through them. He was looking for us but taking his time about it, confident that we couldn't escape. I thought about Courtney upstairs, about the struggle and her screams, and I didn't let myself imagine what had happened to her. The man opened the pantry door wide and Mia screamed. He looked down at us with this expression of mild surprise, as if he'd expected to find us but hadn't expected us to be so small and scared. He was maybe 35 or 40, average height and build, wearing a dark jacket and gloves. His face was unmemorable except for his eyes, which were cold and empty. He crouched down to our level and held out his hand in this grotesque parody of friendliness. "Come on out. I'm not going to hurt you." His voice was calm and reasonable, the tone someone might use to coax a frightened dog out from under a porch. Everything in my body was screaming at me not to trust him, not to move, but he wasn't giving us a choice. He reached in and grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her out of the pantry despite her screaming and kicking. I launched myself at him without thinking, hitting and scratching at his face and arms. He threw me off easily and I hit the kitchen floor hard enough to knock the wind out of me. While I was gasping for air, he picked up Mia and started carrying her toward the stairs. She was fighting and screaming my name and I forced myself up despite the pain, stumbling after them. He turned at the base of the stairs and kicked me in the chest, sending me sprawling again. "Stay there or I'll come back and do worse." Then he carried Mia upstairs while I lay on the floor unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to save my sister. The sirens were louder now, very close, and I heard the man curse upstairs. His footsteps moved quickly across the second floor, and then I heard a window opening. By the time I managed to get up and climb the stairs, he was gone. He'd gone out my parents' bedroom window onto the porch roof and from there to the ground, taking Mia with him. I found Courtney in the hallway outside my parents' room, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, her face bruised and swollen. I knelt beside her, crying and trying to wake her up while sirens screamed outside and red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The police broke down the front door within seconds, flooding into the house with guns drawn. They found me upstairs covered in Courtney's blood, sobbing incoherently about the man who'd taken Mia. The ambulance arrived for Courtney while police officers tried to get information from me about what the kidnapper looked like and which direction he'd gone. I couldn't stop shaking long enough to give them clear answers. Everything was chaos and noise and terror. My parents arrived 30 minutes later, called home by police. My mother's screams when they told her Mia had been taken were worse than anything I'd heard that night. My father kept demanding to know what had happened, how someone had gotten into our house, where the police were looking for his daughter. The officers tried to explain that they were doing everything possible, had set up roadblocks and issued an Amber Alert, but it felt inadequate and slow. Courtney was loaded into the ambulance with a police officer accompanying her to get her statement once she regained consciousness. I was checked by paramedics who said I had bruised ribs and some minor cuts but was otherwise physically unharmed. Physically unharmed. The phrase felt absurd because I'd never been further from unharmed in my life. The police detective assigned to the case was a woman named Laura Rains who had kind eyes and a gentle voice. She asked me to describe everything that happened from the moment we heard the glass break. I told her about Courtney's dismissal of the sounds, her insistence that it was just the cat, how she'd gone upstairs alone despite our fear and warnings. Detective Rains wrote everything down and asked specific questions about the intruder's appearance, his voice, anything that might help identify him. I described what I'd seen, but it felt like nothing, just average features and common clothing. He'd been wearing gloves so there wouldn't be fingerprints. The broken glass upstairs had been the window in my parents' bedroom, which he'd broken from the outside to unlock and climb through. The house had an alarm system, but my parents hadn't armed it when they left because Courtney was there with us. The system was only used when the house was empty. Detective Rains asked if Courtney had mentioned expecting anyone or if she'd been on her phone with anyone. I said no, that she'd been focused on us and the movie. The detective promised they would find Mia, that they had every available officer searching, but her promises felt hollow. The man had at least a 30-minute head start and could be anywhere by now. My father was on his phone calling everyone he could think of, friends with connections to law enforcement, local news stations, anyone who might help. My mother sat on the couch rocking back and forth, beyond tears into some kind of shock state. The house filled with more people over the next hours. Crime scene technicians processed my parents' bedroom and the hallway where Courtney had been attacked. They found blood evidence and signs of struggle, but nothing immediately helpful for identifying the intruder. More detectives arrived to interview me separately from my parents, taking me to the kitchen while my parents stayed in the living room. They asked the same questions in different ways, trying to pull out details I might not realize were important. What exactly had Courtney said? How long between the glass breaking and the footsteps? Had I seen the man touch anything? Did he say anything else besides what I'd already reported? I answered everything as best as I could, but felt increasingly useless. None of my observations seemed to matter because they didn't bring Mia back. Detective Rains kept reassuring me that I'd done nothing wrong, that I'd protected myself as best as I could, but guilt was already settling into my bones. I'd hidden in the pantry while my babysitter was taken. I'd obeyed when Courtney told us to stay downstairs instead of running immediately. I'd been too scared and too obedient, and now Mia was gone. News crews arrived and were kept behind police barriers at the end of our street, but we could see their camera lights and news vans multiplying. Detective Rains said media attention might help, that someone might see Mia and call in a tip. My father agreed to do a press conference, standing in front of the cameras with my mother beside him, both of them pleading for anyone with information to come forward and begging whoever had Mia to let her go. The footage played on every local station and then got picked up nationally. My sister's face was everywhere, her school photo from earlier that year showing her gap-toothed smile and hopeful eyes. The Amber Alert description went out to millions of phones. The man was described as white, average build, 30s to 40s, wearing dark clothing. It was hopelessly generic. Thousands of men fit that description. Courtney regained consciousness in the hospital around midnight and gave her statement to the detective who'd accompanied her. The police came back with that information an hour later. Courtney had been upstairs and opened my parents' bedroom door to find the intruder going through my mother's jewelry box. He'd attacked her immediately, hitting her hard enough to knock her down, then continuing to beat her when she tried to fight back. She'd screamed for us to run before he'd hit her in the head with something, probably my father's bedside lamp, which was found broken on the floor, and she'd lost consciousness. She hadn't gotten a clear look at his face and couldn't add anything to the description I'd already given. The police asked my parents detailed questions about who might have targeted our family. Did they have enemies? Business disputes? Angry former employees? Had anyone been acting strangely or showing too much interest in our routines? My father owned a small accounting firm and my mother was a real estate agent. They were solidly middle class, not wealthy enough to be obvious kidnapping targets. Neither of them could think of anyone who'd want to hurt us. Detective Rains suggested this might not have been personal at all, that the man might have been attempting a burglary and taken Mia impulsively when he was interrupted. But that didn't explain why he'd taken her instead of just running when the police were coming. I sat in the kitchen listening to these theories, and none of them mattered because Mia was still gone. The hours dragged into dawn with no breaks in the case. Police had searched the immediate area and found no trace of Mia or her abductor. Roadblocks had stopped and checked hundreds of vehicles but found nothing. Every lead called into the tip line had been investigated and discarded. By morning, it felt like the trail had gone completely cold. The first 48 hours after a child's abduction are critical. That's what the FBI agent who arrived on Saturday morning told us. After that, the chances of finding them alive drop dramatically. Agent Thomas Kruger was in his 50s with gray hair and a weathered face that had seen too many tragedies. He took over coordination of the search, bringing in additional resources and expertise. He had my parents go through everything again, every detail of their lives, looking for any angle that might explain why Mia had been taken. He had me recount my story multiple times, pushing for details I might have forgotten or dismissed. What hand had the man used to open the pantry door? Had his voice had any accent? Had I heard any vehicles outside? I tried so hard to remember everything perfectly, but trauma had made my memories unreliable. Some details were vivid while others were blank spaces my brain couldn't fill. The media attention intensified with national coverage now. Talk shows discussed our case. Social media exploded with theories and accusations. Some people blamed my parents for going out and leaving us with a babysitter. Others blamed Courtney for not calling the police immediately when she heard suspicious sounds. Everyone had opinions and judgments, and none of it helped find Mia. Courtney was released from the hospital after 2 days and immediately descended into a guilt spiral that required psychiatric intervention. She couldn't stop apologizing, couldn't forgive herself for dismissing the warning signs and going upstairs alone. Her parents hired lawyers worried about potential liability, which added another layer of ugliness to the situation. My parents didn't blame her and told her so repeatedly, but Courtney couldn't accept their forgiveness. She dropped out of college and moved back in with her parents, unable to function. I wanted to hate her for her poor judgment but couldn't quite get there. She'd been a teenager herself, barely an adult, making bad decisions under pressure. But those bad decisions had cost my sister her freedom, and possibly her life. By the end of the first week, the intensive search started winding down. Police still worked the case, but with fewer resources allocated. The FBI maintained involvement, but Agent Kruger warned us that without new leads, there was only so much they could do. The news coverage shifted from constant updates to occasional follow-ups. Life was supposed to somehow continue even though our family was shattered. My parents were destroyed. My mother stopped eating and sleeping, spending every waking moment on social media and missing children websites, convinced she'd find some clue the police had missed. My father threw himself into organizing search parties and maintaining media attention, unable to accept that people were moving on from Mia's disappearance. I went back to school after 2 weeks and it was horrific. Everyone knew about Mia. Some kids were sympathetic, others were cruel in the way only middle schoolers can be. One girl asked if I felt bad for hiding while my sister was taken. A boy suggested my parents had probably sold Mia and staged the kidnapping. The teachers tried to protect me but couldn't shield me from everything. I started having severe anxiety and nightmares. Every sound in our house at night made me freeze in terror. I couldn't be alone in a room without panicking. My parents enrolled me in therapy, but talking about trauma didn't make it go away. 3 months after Mia's abduction, police found a break in the case. A man in a neighboring county had been arrested for attempted burglary, and during processing, his fingerprints were matched to a partial print found on the broken glass of our window. His name was Dennis Volker, 38 years old with a long criminal history of burglary and assault. He'd been released from prison just 2 months before he broke into our house. Police arrested him and brought him in for questioning. He denied everything at first, but eventually admitted to breaking into our house. He said he'd been watching our neighborhood, targeting homes where he saw people leave. He'd seen my parents drive away and assumed the house was empty. He'd broken in to steal jewelry and cash, not expecting anyone to be there. When Courtney came upstairs, he'd panicked and attacked her. And when he'd found Mia and me hiding, he'd grabbed Mia as insurance to help him escape. Dennis Volker described in flat, emotionless detail how he'd taken Mia with him when he jumped from the roof, how he'd put her in his car parked 3 streets over and driven to a storage facility he'd been living in since his release from prison. He said he'd planned to let her go once he was safely away from the area. But Mia had seen his face and could identify him, and he'd panicked about that too. His lawyer tried to stop him from saying more, but Dennis kept talking, maybe because the guilt had been eating at him, or maybe because he was tired of carrying the secret. He told the detectives where he'd left Mia's body, in a wooded area off a rural highway about 40 miles from our house. He said he was sorry, that he'd never meant for things to go that way, that it had all spiraled out of control. They found Mia exactly where he said she'd be, her body wrapped in a tarp and hidden under brush. She'd been strangled within hours of being taken. The medical examiner said she probably died before midnight on that Friday, before my parents even came home from their interrupted dinner. While we'd been hoping and praying and searching, Mia had already been gone. The grief that followed was annihilating. My mother had a complete breakdown requiring hospitalization. My father became a ghost, physically present but emotionally absent. I shut down completely, unable to cry or feel anything beyond numbness. Mia's funeral was attended by hundreds of people, most of whom we didn't know. Strangers who'd followed our story in the news came to pay respects. The media coverage was intense and invasive, cameras trying to capture our pain for evening broadcasts. Dennis Volker's trial started 8 months after Mia's death. He'd pleaded not guilty despite his confession, his lawyers arguing the confession had been coerced. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence beyond the confession, including forensic evidence linking him to our house and to the storage facility. They had the fingerprint match and witnesses who'd seen his car near our neighborhood that night. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I had to testify about what happened that night. Sitting in the courtroom looking at the man who'd taken my sister was surreal. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. Evil should look different, should be identifiable, but Dennis Volker could have been anyone. When the prosecutor asked me to point out the man who'd entered our house that night, my hand shook, raising to point at him. Dennis wouldn't look at me or my parents. He stared at the table in front of him through most of the trial. The defense tried to paint Dennis as a desperate man who'd made terrible mistakes, but wasn't a monster. They presented his difficult childhood, his struggles with addiction, his failed attempts at rehabilitation. They argued that Mia's death hadn't been premeditated, that it had been a panicked reaction from someone who was terrified of going back to prison. The prosecution countered that Dennis had had multiple chances to let Mia go and had instead chosen to kill her to protect himself. Agent Kruger testified about Dennis's criminal history and the predatory nature of his actions that night. Medical examiners testified about Mia's injuries and cause of death. Crime scene specialists presented all the evidence collected from our house. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found Dennis Volker guilty of felony murder, kidnapping, burglary, and assault. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Dennis's mother sobbed in the courtroom. My mother showed no reaction at all, still too medicated and depressed to process what was happening. My father squeezed my hand so tight it hurt. Justice had been served, but it felt meaningless because Mia was still dead. The civil case against Courtney and her parents came later. Other families who'd experienced similar babysitter negligence cases had reached out to my parents, encouraging them to sue to establish precedent and hold babysitters accountable. My parents were reluctant at first, but eventually filed suit claiming Courtney's negligence had directly contributed to Mia's death and my trauma. The lawsuit argued that a reasonable person in Courtney's position would have called police immediately upon hearing glass break and suspicious footsteps instead of dismissing the sounds and investigating alone. That her failure to take the threat seriously had prevented us from escaping and had allowed Dennis Volker time to attack her and take Mia. Courtney's lawyers argued she'd been a victim too, that she'd been assaulted and traumatized, and that suing her was cruel. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years while I tried to rebuild some kind of normal life. I struggled through middle school and high school carrying trauma that set me apart from my peers. Other kids were worried about grades and social drama while I was having panic attacks in bathrooms and seeing therapists twice a week. My parents divorced when I was 15, unable to survive the grief and blame that poisoned their relationship. My mother never recovered mentally and lived in and out of treatment facilities. My father remarried eventually but kept an emotional distance from his new family, unable to risk that kind of pain again. The civil case was settled out of court when I was 16. Courtney's family's insurance paid a substantial sum that my father put in trust for me and donated the rest to missing children organizations. Courtney herself had attempted suicide twice during the legal proceedings and was institutionalized by the time of settlement. The money felt like blood money, compensation for my sister's life and my destroyed childhood. I graduated high school at 17 and immediately enrolled in the police academy, the youngest person in my class. Every single person who interviewed me asked why I wanted to be a cop, and I gave them the sanitized version about wanting to help people and serve my community. The real reason was that I needed to understand how systems failed the night Mia was taken, needed to be the person who didn't dismiss warning signs and who trusted instincts over convenience. I became obsessed with home security, personal safety, situational awareness. Everything I'd learned too late to save my sister became the foundation of who I was. I graduated from the academy at 19 and worked patrol for 3 years before transferring to the Crimes Against Children unit. That's where I belonged, working cases involving endangered kids, missing children, and domestic situations where kids were at risk. I became known as someone who took every call seriously, who investigated every concern no matter how small it seemed. Other officers sometimes thought I was overly cautious or paranoid, but I didn't care. I'd rather check out 100 false alarms than miss one real emergency. My captain understood because he knew my history. Everyone in the department knew why I worked the way I did. By the time I was 27, I'd worked dozens of cases and helped recover multiple missing children. Not all of them came home alive, but more survived because I'd responded fast and thoroughly. I taught safety classes for parents and teens about recognizing danger and trusting instincts. I lectured at the academy about the importance of taking every call seriously, of not letting assumptions override protocols. I told Mia's story over and over, stripping away my privacy to make sure other officers understood the stakes. Every child I helped recover felt like partial atonement for the sister I couldn't save. My therapist said I was trying to undo the past through present action, and she was probably right. But it was the only way I knew how to survive the guilt. When I was 31, I responded to a call from a frantic mother whose children were home with a babysitter who wasn't answering the phone. The mother said her security camera showed the front door standing open and no movement inside the house for 20 minutes. Other officers might have classified it as a low-priority wellness check, but I heard the panic in that mother's voice and remembered my own parents receiving similar news. I broke protocol and went in without backup, weapon drawn and heart pounding. I found the babysitter unconscious in the kitchen and 2 children, ages 8 and 6, hiding in a bedroom closet. A back window was broken and the house had been ransacked. The intruder was gone but had clearly been searching for valuables when the babysitter interrupted him. She'd been hit on the head and knocked out but was alive. The children were terrified but unharmed because they'd heard the confrontation and hidden immediately. They'd stayed in that closet for 30 minutes, too scared to come out even after the intruder left. I stayed with them until their parents arrived, and the mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. That night, I cried for the first time in years, finally releasing some of the weight I'd been carrying. Those children were safe because I'd taken the call seriously and responded immediately. That's what Courtney should have done but didn't. That's what I'll spend the rest of my career doing, taking every threat seriously, trusting instincts, and responding before it's too late. Mia never got a second chance, but every child I help recover is a testament to her memory and a promise that her death meant something. 23 years after I lost my sister, I teach child safety courses and train new officers in threat assessment. The story of the babysitter who said the cat knocked something over continues to save lives by teaching people that authority figures can be wrong, that instincts matter, and that seconds of response time can mean the difference between tragedy and survival. I carry Mia with me every day, and she'll never be forgotten. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.